Makasaysayang araw po. Historic day to everyone. This is Xiao Chua, Public Relations Officer of the Philippine Historical Association. I will be your host for the opening ceremonies of the International Conference of the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation, Southeast Asia, with the theme, Arrivals, Conflict, and Transformation in Maritime Southeast Asia, 1400 to 1800. Brought to you by the Philippine Historical Association, Masyarakat Sejawaran, Indonesia, Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia, the National Quincentennial Committee, the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and the University of San Carlos. Ladies and gentlemen, the national anthems of the Republic of the Philippines, Republic of Indonesia, and the Federation of Malaysia, followed by the ecumenical prayer.
kamighimo tolangit sikoy ko kamighimo to aldo woy bulan ikaw ang nagbuhat sa kabituhunan ikaw ang nagbuhat sa kalibutan manama mawantog ka warag po ko ilingkoy ko o Diyos kahibulungan ka busa ikaw lang ang simbahon ko
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فقال ربكم ادعوني أستجب لكم آمين يا رب العالمين الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم اجمع شمل المسلمين والكريستيان والأمة في مدينة دباو وسلم دائما مجتمعنا هذا بالسلم والأمن والتقدم في بلدنا هذا آمين يا رب العالمين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على خير خلقه سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين يا رب العالمين.
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you today to praise and worship you and give you thanks for all the things you continue to provide for ourselves and our families. Father, we humbly ask for forgiveness for all the times we have offended you, when we forget to acknowledge your presence in the image of our brothers and sisters, and for moments we fail to be good stewards of the blessings you have given us. Continue to guide and protect each one of us, Lord, that we may always walk in the lights of your everlasting love and mercy. Grant us, Father, with your comfort in times of distress and with your strength in times of weakness. Bestow upon us your unending grace and healing, that we in turn become instruments of gentleness and compassion to others. We ask all this in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, with the prayer and the intercession of our Blessed Mother. Amen.
manama mawantog ka warag po ko ilingkoy ko o Diyos kahibulungan ka busa ikaw lang ang simbahon ko busa ikaw lang ang alagaran ko
In 1521, events relating to the first circumnavigation of the world by the Armada de Maluco impacted the lives of the peoples of what would become Southeast Asia in the next 500 years. Aspects of these changes will be examined in this conference by our speakers from around the region. To welcome all our delegates, including our guests from abroad, to this conference and to this important milestone commemoration, we would like to recognize the Vice Chairman of the National Quincentennial Committee of the Republic of the Philippines, and the Chair of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Professor Dr. Rene R. Escalante, to give a few words.
To Dr. Maria Luisa T. Camagay, President of the Philippine Historical Association, to our colleagues from the Society of Indonesian Historians and Malaysian Historical Society, paper readers, guests from across Asia and the world, good morning to all of you. In 2021, the attention of the world will be focused on Southeast Asia because we will be commemorating the 500th anniversary of the first circumnavigation of the world. Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have important roles in this great achievement of mankind. The spices of Indonesia serve as the magnet that attracted the Europeans to go to our region. Malaysia also contributed to the expedition because the slave interpreter of Magellan was a Malaysian. Lastly, the Filipinos also played a big role in the success of the expedition because they offered food, drinks, and shelter to the members of the expedition who were mostly sick and dying when they reached the Samar area. This big event offers mixed reactions and opportunities to us Southeast Asians. Are we going to let it pass as if it is just an ordinary event, given the fact that it's not our history, but of the Europeans? Or are we going to take this rare opportunity to showcase our role in this event and take it as an opportunity to market our products and national assets? On the part of the Philippine government, we have resolved to join the global celebration mainly to advance a cause, that is, to let the world know that our ancestors were not savages, uncivilized, and barbaric when the Magellan expedition arrived in the Philippines in 1521. We will also showcase the hospitality and generosity of our ancestors, hoping that it will contribute to the promotion of our country as a tourist destination and a source of kind-hearted workers. Given the opportunity, we will use the quincentennial commemoration as venue to tell the world that our ancestors were already well integrated with the rest of the Malay world hundreds of years before our first contact with the Europeans. The ancestors of Filipinos knew Malay, the language of Enrique de Malacca, which enabled him to communicate with the Rahas of Eastern Visayan region. You will be surprised of the deep-rooted interconnectedness between our ancestors with other Southeast Asians. The warriors from Luzon joined the Muslim Armada in the retaking of Malacca from the Portuguese and in the Muslim expansion of Aceh in Sumatra. The remaining crew of the Magellan Elcano expedition encountered in Brunei Bay the Prince of Luzon, who happened to be the grandson and admiral of the Sultan of Brunei. This without mentioning the fact that the pre-colonial Filipinos also fell under the sway not only of the Hindu culture of the Srivijaya and Majapahit Empire, but also of Islam coming from Aceh, Brunei, and Malacca. These are some of the things from the pre-colonial times that most Filipinos are unaware of. This is precisely the reason why the National Historical Commission of the Philippines is pushing for cultural and historical cooperation with our Southeast Asian neighbors, as well as with the rest of the Asian countries, which had Asian ties with our ancestors. Recently, I had the opportunity to visit Jakarta, Ternate, Malacca, and Kuala Lumpur with the Philippine Historical Association to promote and encourage scholarship on Philippine pre-colonial history. With these endeavors, I am confident that more and more Filipinos will gradually appreciate our common heritage and hopefully will lead to more cultural and academic activities that will further strengthen our ties with each other. I am hoping that this three-day conference will be a fruitful one. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines has committed to support the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation, Southeast Asia. We will extend financial assistance in whatever way we can. We will publish some of the papers, and we have ensured that this international conference is streamed across various government platforms in the Philippines to reach more educators, students, lovers of history, and cultural workers. Terima kasih. Salamat datang di Pilipinas. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Rene Escalante, for your welcome remarks and for your support. We would like to remind everyone that we are currently streamed live on the Facebook pages of the Philippine Historical Association, the National Quincentennial Committee, Republic of the Philippines, the LSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Department of Education of the Republic, Local Historical Committees Network, and Project Saysay, and the University of San Carlos, Cebu, for free in the public interest. For an overview of the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation Southeast Asia, or the ICHCC-SEA, I would like to recognize the association's immediate past president and commissioner of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Dr. Emmanuel Franco Calair.
Good morning, everyone. In September 2014, during the regular board meeting of the Philippine Historical Association, the body decided to convene an international conference to celebrate its 60th founding anniversary the following year. From October 2014 to January 2015, PHA held its regular meeting at UST through the office of Dr. Evelyn Songco, the UST Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and VP of PHA. The following month, the UST Department of History referred the PHA officers to the Malaysian Historical Society. The exchange of emails of both organizations ended up with PHA visiting Kuala Lumpur in March 2015 and exploring possible partnership with both organizations. Eventually, Society of Indonesian Historians joined the discussion. The three organizations agreed to sponsor an international conference to be held in Manila in August 2015. On the occasion of the 60th founding anniversary of PHA, the three organizations convened the international conference focusing on historical education in Asia. On the first day of the conference, the three organizations met and agreed in a form of memorandum of understanding that they will mutually bind themselves and carry out the following partnerships. Number one, holding of joint regional conference. Second, to facilitate academic exchange. Third, cooperative research. Fourth, joint training programs. Fifth, cultural visits and other possible exchanges. The MOU organized and established the regional network or consortium of the three organizations with the end goal of highlighting regional, common, and shared identity as basis for academic cooperation. Areas of cooperation include, but not limited to, cultural heritage, tourism, multiculturalism, cultural diversities, education, and the arts. The next day, the officers of the three organizations signed the MOU in the presence of 500 conference participants, establishing the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation Southeast Asia. Since 2015, the consortium is actively collaborating in hosting international conferences held in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And we prepared a short video of these activities of the consortium to further acquaint us about the said partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manny Calayim. I would like to recognize now the Director of the DLSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, the conference convener and Vice President of the Philippine Historical Association, Dr. Fernando Santiago Jr., for the conference overview and the introduction to the first keynote speaker.
I have the pleasure to welcome you all to the conference of the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation Southeast Asia, or the ICHCC-SEA, and the 2020 Annual Conference of the Philippine Historical Association with the theme Arrival, Conflict, and Transformation in Maritime Southeast Asia circa 1400 to 1800. My task is to give you an overview of our activities over the next 3 days. We shall begin with the keynote lecture to be delivered by Professor Farish Noor of the Nanyang Technological University, and his lecture, entitled Dragged into the Wars of Others, Southeast Asia's Entanglement with the Wars of Europe from the 30 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars, will set the tone for the conference. The keynote lecture will be followed by presentations made by representatives of the 3 associations that comprise the International Council for Historical and Cultural Cooperation Southeast Asia. The Philippine Historical Association will be represented by Dr. Ariel C. Lopez of the University of the Philippines-Diliman, and Professor Ambeth R. Ocampo of the Ateneo de Manila University. The Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia will be represented by Professor Dato Ahmad Murad Merican, while Dr. Andy Aktian and Dr. Gani Jelani shall represent the Masyarakat Sejarawan Indonesia. The first day will end with a synthesis of the day's lectures by Philippine Historical Association board member Gloria E. Melencio. Tomorrow, we will begin our day with a discussion of teaching materials concerning the events being celebrated in the quincentennial Michael Xiao Chua of De La Salle University will discuss such materials with Ian Christopher Alfonso of the National Quincentennial Committee and Dr. Jose Eleazar R. Bersales of the University of San Carlos Museum. Professor Jose Victor Torres of De La Salle University will deliver the keynote lecture for the second day with his talk, The Mojares Panel, Investigation into the 1521 First Easter Mass Controversy, Accessibility, Technology, and Discoveries. His talk will be followed by a special lecture by Feliz Prudente Santa Maria, trustee of the National Museum of the Philippines, on To Feed or Not to Feed Philippine Encounters During the First Circumnavigation 1521. The rest of the day will be devoted to panel sessions on maritime trade in Southeast Asia, with a synthesis to be made by Dr. Wensley M. Reyes, board member of the Philippine Historical Association. The last day will cover panel sessions on the Philippines and Southeast Asia and Christianity in the Philippines. Over the next 3 days, scholars from the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, China, and India will share their research on various topics of relevance to the said themes. We shall end the conference with a synthesis and closing remarks to be delivered by the President of the Philippine Historical Association, Professor Dr. Maria Luisa T. Camagay. We expect the coming days to be knowledge-filled and thought-provoking. On behalf of the organizers of the conference, we wish you all a productive conference and may it lead to a deeper appreciation and understanding of our region. Mabuhay tayong lahat. I will now proceed to the introduction of our keynote speaker. Our distinguished speaker is Associate Professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. His latest works include Racial Difference and Colonial Wars of Southeast Asia, 1800 to 1900, edited by Peter Carey, to be published in 2021. Data Collecting in Colonial Southeast Asia, Framing the Other, published in 2020. Before the Pivot, America's Encounters with Southeast Asia, 1800 to 1900, published in 2018. And The Discursive Construction of Southeast Asia in 19th Century Colonial Capitalist Discourse, published in 2016, all by the Amsterdam University Press. He is also a senior fellow of the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. He lives and works in Singapore. And so without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, with great pleasure, I introduce to you Professor Farish Noor.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and I would like to begin by tendering my thanks to the organizers of this event, the Historical Association of the Philippines, the Historical Association of Malaysia, and the Historical Association of Indonesia. I feel that you have done me a tremendous honor with this invitation, one that I cannot possibly hope to repay in kind, but I'm very touched and very grateful for this opportunity to be with all of you today to discuss what I think is a very important landmark event in our collective Southeast Asian history. Since the topic of our conference, this conference, is about the long period of contact between Southeast Asia and Western Europe, I chose for my topic for today's presentation, our entanglements, Southeast Asia's entanglements with the wars of Europe, and how, as a result of these wars, Southeast Asian history became part of global history. Now, let us perhaps begin in the immediate present. Now, for those of us, with perhaps the exception of someone who's perhaps been orbiting the Earth in a space station or living on Mars, but most of us who are living in the here and now would undoubtedly be aware of the way in which Southeast Asia has been presented in the media in recent times. We are all familiar with the tropes and stereotypes of Southeast Asia as depicted in the popular media, but also in the way in which Southeast Asia in recent years has loomed rather large in international reporting, and in particular, when discussing the superpower contestation that we are seeing, very close to our region. Many of us must, of course, be familiar with the way in which the current state of geopolitics in our part of the world, in maritime Southeast Asia, has been described in various political studies, analysis, newspaper reports, and often we come across words such as impending crisis or looming danger or what have you. The impression that one would get if one were not familiar with Southeast Asian history is that what's happening now, in particular the kind of contestation, superpower contestation that we are seeing in the South China Sea, all points to a state of impending crisis, and it's presented as something that is somehow new. My contention in this presentation is that nothing is new in politics. There's a philosophical side to this argument, and there's a historical side to this argument. The philosophical side of the argument is simply this, that newness, radical newness, almost never, ever occurs in the world, because anything that is seen as new or novel or unprecedented has to be recognized as such. And by virtue of being recognized as such, as seen as something new, it can only be new in terms of that which is already known and familiar. Therefore, one could argue that we never really encounter newness in world politics, in world history. And when we locate this discussion in the context of our history, our collective Southeast Asian history, it becomes patently clear that Southeast Asia has never been a stranger to contestation, political contestation, external contestation, and contestation. Okay, excuse me, someone has his mic on. So Southeast Asia has never been a stranger to external contestation or contestation from other powers from beyond. So what I want to do here in the short space of time that I've been given is to basically recount our long history, a very long history of our contact with different parts of Asia and different parts of the world, and to show how throughout our history, Southeast Asian history has always been world history. It's always been regional history, and we need to somehow relocate all these discussions in the context of a broader, longer, more complex history than many of us perhaps recognize or want to acknowledge. So let's begin by somehow going back to a kind of pre-colonial setting that I think is captured very well in the works of scholars like K.N. Chowdhury. One work that comes to mind and which I think is very important for our discussion here is K.N. Chowdhury's book, Asia Before Europe, Trade and Commerce and Settlement in Asia from the Coming of Islam to 1750. Now in this book, Chowdhury gives us a somewhat vivid impression of what life was like in our part of the world, Southeast Asia, that was connected to other parts of the greater Asian continent. And we as historians know this. We know of the long history of cultural contact, the movement of people, the settlement of communities, the movement of commodities, the movement of ideas, the movement of languages, and the long process of cross-fertilization that took place across the whole of the Asian continent, of which what we now call Southeast Asia was simply one part of a much greater whole. The reason why Chowdhury's book, I think, is important for us is that it reminds us that there was once a time when what we now regard as Asia as a whole was an undivided continuum, and where these geopolitical blocks that we work with today, categories such as Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, did not pertain simply because these geopolitical coordinates and these geopolitical blocks were not of our invention. They were imposed on us as a result of the process of colonization. But what Chowdhury points to is the way in which, in our own ways and on our own terms, Asians, including Southeast Asians, were able to live in a highly diverse and complex world of an interconnected Asia, where there was not one, but rather many centers of cultural production, philosophical production, a material commodity production that were in a state of constant interaction with one another. Now, this, of course, does not mean that Asians throughout history have lived peacefully among themselves. I think we would be deluding ourselves if we were to entertain the idea that prior to the colonial contact, all of Asia and all of Southeast Asia was in a state of peace and stability, and there were cordial relations all the time. This, we know, is certainly not the case, because the polities of Southeast Asia behaved like the polities of any other part of the world. They were in a state of mutual dependency, but also rivalry and competition, and many times. And from this, polycentered Southeast Asia in the past emerged, kingdoms from Srivijaya to Lankasuka to Mataram to Majapahit to Malacca to Aceh that were in a very dynamic process of constant interaction and at times rivalry. What is interesting is how, in instances of potential conflict or rivalry, the states of Southeast Asia were able to develop various means through which some semblance of stability and normality could be maintained in order to allow economic life, political life to continue. So we are all familiar with the various diplomatic strategies that were used at the time, from strategic alliances, instrumental alliances, from the practice of tribute paying to vassalage. All of this basically points to a local political genius where Southeast Asian polities and Southeast Asian ruling elites were able to find some means of coexistence where both internal and external demands were balanced through a praxis of, intelligent, pragmatic statecraft, long before we talk about, the kind of hedging policies that we see being practiced in Southeast Asia today. So again, none of this is new. The change, however, comes when the encounters between Southeast Asia and Europe move on to a different register altogether, a different kind of dynamic. And this is really when the powers of Western Europe cease to be merely kingdoms in one part of the world and begin to entertain their imperial ambitions. And this is why I've chosen to begin with the 30-Year War. As a historical aside, there's always been this question of what really was the First World War. Now, of course, many historians today, including historians of military history, have begun to dispute the claim that the First World War was actually the First World War. There have been some, like Paul Fregosi, for instance, who have argued in his book that the Napoleonic Wars could be seen as the First World War. Other historians have pushed the date back even further to argue that perhaps the 7 Years' War could be seen as the actual First World War. So at this point, allow me to throw in my bit and make the claim that, in my opinion, it was actually the 30-Year War that was the First World War. And its impact on Southeast Asia can only be understood in global terms. So this is where I would like to really begin my presentation. We are, of course, today talking about Europe's contact with Southeast Asia, beginning from the time of Magellan onwards. For reasons that I hope to make clear, I do believe that this initial period of encounter, particularly with the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese in the 15th and 16th centuries was somewhat different from the subsequent encounters that took place from the 17th century onwards. And for me, the 30-Year War marks an important turning point. So this will be the first conflict that I want to analyze. And I want to analyze these European conflicts, not for their own sake, but really to try to trace their linkages to other parts of the world, other parts of Asia, and to our part of the world in particular. So let's start with the 30-Year War. Now, ostensibly, of course, most people, many historians have basically said that the 30-Year War was basically an intra-religious, intra-European conflict that took place in Central and Western Europe, and it has been conventionally portrayed as a religious conflict between the various Catholic and Protestant communities of Europe. Now, that's only true to a limited extent, I would argue, because notwithstanding the fact that in the wake of the 30-Year War, with the signing, the ratification of the Peace of Munster in 1648, the emergence of the modern nation state with its fixed territorial boundaries is a legacy that all of us have had to live with. But notwithstanding the ostensible religious justification for the conflict that took place in Europe, in many, many ways, the 30-Year War marks a radical shift in European history because it really marks the birth of the modern secular capitalist state and its ideology of colonial capitalism in Europe and beyond the borders of Europe. So by the time we get to the end of the 30-Year War, from 1618 to 1648, there are two important developments that take place. One, we see the birth of new nations, such as the Dutch Republic, Republic of Holland, that emerges after its long 80-year war with Spain. But crucially, the emergence of these new contending powers in Europe are really driven by not the forces of patriotism or religion, but capitalism. Because it is economic nationalism that really takes off in Europe, and the spirit of economic nationalism, which is a major driver for nationalism at large in Europe, ends up being embodied in the form of institutions such as the new colonial companies, the Dutch East Indies Company, the English East India Company, and a whole string of other national companies, the French Compagnie des Indes, that come after that. This marks an important shift in the way in which Europe views itself and views the world. The Dutch East Indies Company, for instance, began as a wholly secular enterprise with the stated aim of using capital to gain capital, and to gain capital through the acquisition of territories. This coming at a time when the European powers have begun to spread beyond the borders of Europe and have begun to establish their respective empires, notably in South America and Central America, marks the beginning of a contestation within Europe that then is exported beyond the borders of Europe to other parts of Africa and Asia. So by the time the 30-year war, is being fought in earnest from 1618 to 1648, as Holland hopes to weaken its enemies, Spain, the war between Holland and Spain and the war between Holland and Portugal is not merely fought in Europe, it's fought abroad. It's fought in Africa, it is fought in the West Indies, it is fought in the Indian subcontinent, and for our purposes, what's crucial for us is the way in which it was fought here in Southeast Asia. So we're all familiar with the events that take place. The Dutch, in their attempt to weaken their Spanish and Portuguese adversaries, begin to hit at the heart of Spain and Portugal overseas, in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And that's why it doesn't come as any surprise to us that it was during this time, while this war in Europe is being fought, Holland is expanding its sphere of influence in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia. The conquest of Malacca, for instance, in 1641, the attempts by the Dutch to attack the imperial colonial possessions of Spain, such as the various attacks on Manila in Spanish Philippines from 1610 all the way to 1646. All these things happen at a time when Holland is emerging as a new nation state in Europe and needs to stamp its presence on the European political landscape by establishing itself as an imperial power. And this it does by not only defeating and conquering the colonial possessions of Spain and Portugal in Southeast Asia, but also acquiring new territories from Ambon in 1605 to the attack on Jayakarta, which culminates with the defeat of Jayakarta and the creation of Batavia in 1619. And the net result of what is basically a European war brought to our part of the world is the further weakening of the polities and the economies of Southeast Asia. So, for instance, with the creation of Dutch-controlled Batavia in Java, the polity that suffers this is Banten, which in previous times had been one of the major economic centers of Southeast Asia, rivaling Malacca and Aceh and trading with other parts of the world. The arrival of the Dutch as a new power is not merely a new European power, but a new European power that comes with a new ideology, a new stated intent. And this, in a sense, is reflected in the way in which, subsequent Dutch conquests across Southeast Asia not only weaken the Spanish and Portuguese empires, but introduces a new kind of praxis of colonialism that is really guided by the ethos and the logic of capitalism. So the phrase used by Said Hussein Alatas, colonial capitalism, I think is important here. As an example of this, one can think of what the Dutch did after they defeated the Portuguese in Malacca, after taking over the Portuguese settlement in Malacca. They renamed all the buildings and fortifications that had been built by the Portuguese earlier. The Portuguese had named these buildings after saints and religious figures, and that says something about the religious tenor of early Spanish and Portuguese colonization. But when the Dutch arrived, they renamed all these buildings and monuments after the names of the corporate company directors of the Dutch East Indies Company. So we can see already then the emergence of a new kind of corporatist capitalist colonial logic at work. And that's why, for me, the 30-Year War marks, the beginnings of something new, the emergence of a modern capital-driven form of colonization in Southeast Asia. And this continues. This continues all the way up throughout the 17th century, all the way throughout the so-called Dutch Golden Age, and up to the 18th century, where Europe remains in a state of conflict. By the time we get to the 18th century, we see the development of this very commercial-minded, capital-driven form of economic nationalism gaining ground across practically every major power in Western Europe. So, for instance, in the year 1714, in England, the Act for the Better Regulation of Lawful Trade of English Merchants Trading to and from the East Indies is passed in England by the British Parliament. Now, the 1714 Act for the Better Regulation of Trade is a very interesting document, and there were many documents, similar kinds of laws being passed in other parts of Europe as well, which I think we need to look at. Now, what's interesting about the 1714 Act that was passed in England is that henceforth, what the Act does is that it prevented any English merchant, British merchant, while trading in Southeast Asia, to have any contact or any commercial interaction with any other European. English merchants were no longer allowed to travel to India, to Southeast Asia, to China on non-British ships, ships that did not fly the flag of England. And what this meant was that a spirit of strong economic nationalism had taken root in England and also in France, Holland, Spain, and the other countries of Europe, whereby the economic rivalry between these European powers would determine the manner in which not only they conducted their trade with our ancestors in Southeast Asia, but the manner in which they saw Southeast Asia now as a potential battleground where the economic rivalries of Europe would be fought. And this leads us all the way up to the next important conflict, which is, of course, the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, where we have a continuation of these rivalries taking place in Europe being reenacted or exported to other parts of the world. By then, of course, by the second half of the 18th century, the sun of Holland had waned, and we are witnessing the emergence of two new powerful European rivals, namely England and France. Now, again, we in Southeast Asia might ask, well, why should we Southeast Asians be concerned about, the wars of others, the wars of these Europeans? I hope that, as I go along, this will become increasingly clear. There are two reasons why these wars in Europe have an important significance for us here in Southeast Asia. Firstly, because, as I've said earlier, these later wars from the 17th, 18th to 19th centuries were very different wars that were being fought by modern nation states that were really driven by economic political goals. But the net result of these conflicts within Europe was that they also contributed to the expansion of the empires of Europe across Asia. And as a result of that, by the time we get to the 18th century, our contact, Southeast Asia's contact with other parts of Asia that were once our closest, longest, oldest civilizational neighbors, notably India and China, would grow weaker and weaker. So this is the second impact of these wars, that they effectively distance us from other parts of Asia that were once part of our common Greater Asia identity and homeland. So by the time we get to the 7 Years' War, we see the bitter rivalry fought between England and France being acted out in India, having enormous consequences, not only on the polities of India, but also on the future political history of Southeast Asia. Of course, it was India that was the prize for both the British and the French, and the Carnatic Wars were a time where Britain did everything it could to ensure that the French would not have a hold on India. The perhaps starting point would be the British conquest of Bengal after the Battle of Plassey of 1757, where Robert Clive manages to defeat the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj al-Dawla, but crucially also defeat his French allies. And in the course of doing so, France's presence, not only in South Asia, but also in Southeast Asia, was diminished. Often, we historians of Southeast Asia overlook or forget to make these very crucial connections between what has happened in South Asia, East Asia, and our own part of the world, partly because we ourselves have internalized this logic of geopolitical compartmentalization, where somehow South Asia is seen as distant from us. But remember that at that time in the 18th century, France's presence in India was also bolstered by its attempt to establish a presence in Burma. And Burma plays a very important role, a pivotal role, in fact, in the story of Southeast Asia at this time, because as a consequence of Britain's victory in Bengal, Britain was able to expand its sphere of influence across North India, then move into South India and Central India, but also to contain the growing presence of France that was at the time attempting to establish, a presence in what we call Burma today. Now, here's also one of the great ironies of Southeast Asian history. It was at this time when Britain attempted to control and contain and foreclose the possibility of a French, presence in Burma, that Britain was allied to Burma, the Burmans themselves. This, sadly, for the Burmans would change in the century to come, where the former allies of the Burmese would end up being their bitter enemies. For Britain would later, turn against the Burmans in the subsequent First, Second, and Third Anglo-Burmese Wars. So throughout the period of the 7 Year War, these conflicts in Europe were being fought out again in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia. And I'm sure all our friends from the Philippines will be familiar with the very brief period of British occupation of Manila that also took place during this time, when Dawson Drake of the East India Company attempted to occupy Manila while Britain was at war with Spain back in the European continent. So these European wars then impact upon us in Southeast Asia. And as they drag us into their conflicts, they also sever our links to other parts of Asia that were once our close, political, economic, and civilizational cultural neighbors, notably China and India. This process continues, it intensifies all the way up to the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. And by the time we get to the French Revolutionary Wars, then really maritime Southeast Asia becomes the battleground for the contest for hegemony, not only in Europe but in the colonies abroad. From the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars of 1792 all the way to 1802, we have, revolutionary France attempting to hold on to, its colonial possessions in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, battling against, a string of coalitions, the war of the first, second, third, fourth coalitions in Europe, led by countries like Britain. For Britain, after gaining control of Bengal and establishing its presence in parts of Southeast Asia, such as its deceitful acquisition of Penang by Francis Light, the strategic, political, economic imperative at the time was to prevent any possibility of France establishing a presence anywhere in maritime Southeast Asia. And so the period of the French Revolutionary Wars are actually very interesting for us, particularly in our part of Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia, because the wars between Britain, France, and Holland were fought mainly at sea. And this was the time of the naval battles that were being fought between the British Navy naval squadron based in Southeast Asia, led by people like Admiral Reyna, and the French naval squadron led by people like Admiral Pierre de Cercy. Now, what is interesting about this period is that the contest for control of Southeast Asia was being fought not only in terms of the acquisition of territories, of terrestrial gains, but crucially of control of the waters of Southeast Asia. And for us, Malaysians, Filipinos, Indonesians, this is of enormous importance because it is during this time when Britain, Holland, and France were competing for hegemony over the control of the waters of Southeast Asia that our ancestors lost control of our natural waterways, our oceanic pathways, the loss of control of the South China Sea, the Java Sea, the Sulawesi Sea, the Sunda Straits, the Malacca Straits. All of this happened at the time when European states, using increasingly advanced military technology, new forms of weaponry, the beginning of the era of the frigate and later the gunboat, would basically mean that the maritime prowess, our capabilities of defending our territorial waters, began to diminish. It's also interesting to note that during this time, when we look at the ways in which Britain and France in particular fought their campaigns at sea, the campaigns, the tactics that were used were basically less conventional when compared to the naval battles that were being fought in the European theater. The French commander, for instance, Admiral de Cercy, because he commanded a relatively small squadron of French frigates, no more than a dozen ships, was compelled to resort to what we can perhaps call, guerrilla tactics, using these ships as raiders or privateers to attack, to rob, to steal, and to hijack, British commercial vessels in order to cripple British trade in Southeast Asia and Britain's economic links to China and India. Now, the reason why I bring this up now, of course, is that later on in the 19th century, it would be us, Southeast Asians, who would be, accused of being pirates and brigands and privateers, whereas actually the most among the most significant acts of privateering that actually took place in the waters of Southeast Asia from the late 18th to early 19th century were by the Europeans themselves, because let's not forget, it was European ships that were attacking, hijacking, and robbing other European ships in order to cripple the trade networks that they were attempting to build. So by the time we get to the 19th century, then our Southeast Asian economic ties with our regional neighbors in China, the Chinese market, the Korean market, the Japanese market, the Indian market grows weaker and weaker and weaker as we lose control of the seas, thanks to the superior naval technology that is being brought to bear upon our maritime territory by these external powers, who, again, remember, are fighting their European war in Europe, but in our backyard in Southeast Asia. And this continues. This continues all the way up to the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 all the way to 1815. And this period of conflict intensifies. The rivalry and antagonism between the various European powers intensifies even further, particularly after Napoleon's failed attempt to occupy Egypt, which for the British, marked a major existential threat, not only to England, but crucially to their British Empire abroad, because of the fear that had Napoleon succeeded in conquering Egypt, that would have formed the bridgehead for a French expansion from Egypt to India to Southeast Asia, all the way to China. So by the time we get to the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, we see this intra-European conflict becoming more aggressive, more cutthroat. It's a do-or-die situation because of the perceived existential threat to the economic and political well-being of the respective European countries. And where are these wars fought? Not only on the battlefields of Europe, not only at Austerlitz or Jena or Wagram, but in our part of the world. And this culminates in instances of aggression and conquest, such as the British occupation of Java from 1811 to 1816. Now, the British occupation of Java, as so well documented by, in the work of Peter Carey, was basically an extension of the Napoleonic Wars being fought here in our part of the world. And Britain invades Java because Holland had by then been allied to France, had become one of the sister republics allied to revolutionary France. So because of this, we begin to see how Britain's political anxiety, the fear of being confronted by two republics in Europe, revolutionary France, revolutionary Holland, leads it to wage a war not only in the European continent, but to strike at the respective empires and colonial possessions of its adversaries in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world as well. The occupation of Java, of course, is, I think, well documented. Some of you, and I'm sure our Indonesian colleagues would be familiar with this, but we see again the close workings of capital and political and military power in the entire period of occupation, because what it brought to the fore was, the rise of then relatively young, relatively unknown East India Company official by the name of Stamford Raffles, who would be promoted, to become the lieutenant governor of Java by his mentor, the Earl Minto, who was then Governor General of British India. All of this is being done, through the auspices of a colonial company, the East India Company, that has really transformed and evolved to become a weaponized, militarized, commercial political entity. And this form of colonization from the 18th to the 19th century in Southeast Asia gives rise to a very different kind of colony, an extractive colony where the landmass of other nations, other peoples, is seen as, something that can be commodified and be controlled and used and exploited in order to gain resources that would be redirected back to Europe in order to augment even further the coffers and the economic and political power of these European states in their intra-European rivalry with one another. So what are the colonies then? The colonies, including the colonies here in Southeast Asia, are basically extractive colonies that are only there to be exploited in order to augment the power of the colonial metropole in what is basically an intra-European conflict. And this would continue throughout the 19th century as Britain manages to defeat its rivals, contains the potential threat of France. Britain is given the opportunity to intervene more and more into the affairs of Southeast Asian countries. Burma, that I've talked about earlier, becomes an unfortunate victim as its erstwhile ally, its former ally, England, turns against it, and we have a succession of three wars: the first, second, and the third Anglo-Burmese wars of 1824-26, 1852-53, and 1885, which basically leads to Burma being completely dissected and eventually entirely colonized, with the ruling family of Burma deposed, and eventually Burma being absorbed into the territory of British India. We see the same kind of expansionism as the British move into the territories of the Malay kingdoms of the Malay Peninsula, and following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, after Britain is forced to give back Java to the Dutch, the same Stamford Raffles, through means both fair and foul, continues in his antagonistic attitude towards the Dutch, and gains a major tactical advantage through the acquisition of Singapore, which would later become one of the major trading and naval centers of the British Empire in Southeast Asia. The rest of the 19th century, unfortunately, is a catalogue of disasters for us, where partly due to the already existing rivalries and contestation between the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, the politics of divide and rule is used by the various European powers to gain further ground, and this will eventually lead to the loss of power of the last remaining, important commercial and political polities of Southeast Asia. Earlier on, I talked about how piracy was in fact the norm of warfare employed by the Europeans against each other during the Revolutionary Wars. But by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, piracy gets racialized and it becomes a Southeast Asian problem. And this, unfortunately, is demonstrated in the most tragic ways with the campaign against Brunei, which ultimately culminates with the defeat of Brunei at the hands of the Royal Navy in 1846, and the acquisition of Labuan as another major commercial center and strategic base for the British Navy in Southeast Asia. For the rest of the 19th century, these wars continue as France begins to move into Southeast Asia as well. And I think I'll only refer to two more important wars that I think have an impact on us. Thus far, I've talked mainly about the powers of Western Europe, but let's not forget the arrival of America and the Americans who arrived to Southeast Asia also, driven by the need for capital acquisition and the need to have trade links and open markets in Asia and East Asia. I think one conflict that we in Southeast Asia often tend to forget and not pay enough attention to is a conflict that was fought thousands of miles away in the American continent, and by this I'm referring to the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Now, for me, this is perhaps one of the most important wars of the 19th century, because what happens by the end of the American-Mexican War of 1846-1848 is that America, for the first time in its history, becomes a Pacific power. Prior to that, America's face to the world was the Atlantic Ocean. But with after the war with Mexico, Mexico loses not only Texas, but crucially Nevada, Utah, and California. Now, the loss of California meant that America, for the first time, would have direct access to the Pacific Ocean, and this means that America becomes a superpower, a potential superpower that has, two faces facing west and east at the same time. It is from this point onwards that America intensifies its efforts to establish also a presence in our part of the world, in East Asia and in Southeast Asia. And again, it has to be remembered. Yeah, I mean, it's very fashionable today for people to talk about America as an imperial neo-hegemon or what have you. But let's not forget that at the beginning of American history, the early generation of American elites, including people like Abraham Lincoln, were very much opposed to American expansionism abroad, through organizations and movements like the American Anti-Imperialist League. However, following the defeat of Mexico and America's acquisition of California, the mood in America changes and America becomes increasingly ambitious and aggressive in the pursuit of its geopolitical, geoeconomic ends in the Pacific region. And again, this is driven by capital. It's driven by the search for markets and profits, markets and profits. All of this, of course, would continue until the American-Spanish War of 1898. And sadly, we all know the results. Not only does America go to war with what's left of the Spanish Empire, it acquires territories such as Puerto Rico and the rest, but it also gives America the pretext for moving into Southeast Asia through the war with the Spanish in the Philippines, which very sadly quickly then devolves into the the Philippine-American War, which finally ends in 1902. So the rest, unfortunately, is our sad legacy and our sad history. Now, one would ask, well, in the midst of all this, what happened to our neighbors? What happened to our neighbors? Where was India in all this? Where were the kingdoms of India? Where was China in all this? Our Southeast Asian connections that was so strong, so important, in the genesis and the development of our various nations and polities in Southeast Asia had always been a symbiotic process where through cultural borrowing, through movement, migration, settlement, through the transference of ideas, the movement of philosophies and vocabularies, Southeast Asia was born within the larger cradle of Asia. Asia is our womb, the womb that gave birth to all our regions that we know today. But throughout this long period of conflict that takes place from the 17th century to the 20th century, what really happens is that what happened was that this multilingual, multifaceted dialogue between the various cultural, economic, political centers of Asia, from East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, eventually gets dimmed and silenced as our Asian continent is carved up into these neat blocks that we know today as Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and what have you. Our ties to our regional neighbors, our ties within our region also get stifled and blocked as a result of our loss of control over territories and of our maritime trade routes as a result of the kind of superior naval technology that was brought to bear upon our ancestors. So India fades into the distance. China fades into the distance. China, by the 18th and 19th century, is already going through a convoluted period of internal crisis with the decline of the Ming dynasty and the emergence of the Qing dynasty. We begin to see China too being dragged into this politics of dependency on trade with the European powers, crucially dependency on silver coming from the European powers, thereby further weakening it. And of course, with the discovery of opium and the mass export of opium, the economy of China is further weakened through the opium trade that is encouraged by the British colonial companies and the other European colonial companies. When we look at India, of course, India too had a very interesting dynamics of its own with the waning of the Mughal Empire the weakening of power of the Mughal Empire created a power vacuum where there emerged new contenders, new rival powers in India, such as the Kingdom of Mysore, the Kingdom of Hyderabad, and the power of the Marathas. But the intra-Indian, the internal Indian disputes between the Marathas, the Hyderabadis, the Mysoreans, the remnants of the Mughal powers and the various Nawab states gave an opportunity for countries like Britain and France and also Holland to intervene in Indian affairs. And we have a very similar playing out of events taking place in India, where one Indian power would be used against another Indian power, contributing again to, unfortunately, the same kind of politics of divide and rule, which eventually weakens India, but crucially means that India is no longer in a position to help or to even remain in dialogue with their cultural civilizational neighbors next door in Southeast Asia. So we lost it. We lost our contacts with our neighbors. We ceased being Asians and we became Southeast Asians. We ended up being circumscribed within increasingly tight and tighter and tighter and narrower geopolitical, geoeconomic borders. As a result of these conflicts that were taking place in other parts of the world, notably Europe. So it's not as if Asia faded, but Asia, other parts of Asia, were relegated further and further into the background. Now, I realize that what I've given you, in this rather long, broad, history of our long, messy, complicated, complex entanglement with the powers of Europe is a somewhat depressing recounting of our history as Southeast Asians. I hope you had your breakfast before this, by the way, and I apologize for that. Now, having given this rather long accounting and complex accounting of how we became entangled with the rest of the world, I suppose I need to offer some kind of justification. And in doing so, I'll try to summarize what I think are the key important factors for all of us as scholars of Southeast Asia and historians of Southeast Asia to always bear in mind. The first would be to go back to the past, and to always remember that long before we came to know ourselves as we know ourselves today as Southeast Asians, living in a neatly demarcated, block within Asia, our ancestors rather, were part of a far more complex, interconnected, interdependent, multipolar, polynuclear Asian continuum, a great spectrum of socioeconomic cultural life, which was captured very well in the works of Chowdhury that I mentioned earlier, but would eventually be, superseded, surpassed, and marginalized in time. Secondly, this process of the compartmentalization of Asia through colonization was always a process that was guided by the needs and demands of capital. And that's why, for me, the 17th century marks that important turning point. It's from the 1600s onwards, again, with the rise and the emergence of these new colonial companies, with the ethos of economic nationalism, becoming dominant forces in places like England, Holland, and other parts of Europe, we begin to see a very different type of colonization. It's no longer missionary colonizations. It's economic colonization driven by capital. And capital plays an enormous role in the process of colonization. And which is why, again, I would say the term coined by Said Hussein Alatas, colonial capitalism, is the most appropriate term to describe the late colonization of not only Southeast Asia, but all of Asia and Africa, because this was colonization that was driven by capital for capital, with the means and the goal of colonization being the acquisition of even more capital. Countries don't invade each other for fun. No country invades another territory just because it wants a beach, to go and have a vacation in. That doesn't happen. Countries invade other territories because those territories are seen as commodities, or they can be commodifiable. And that's what we became. Southeast Asians, as peoples, as nations, were relegated to the background as the natural wealth of our part of the world became commodified. And we cannot have a discussion of colonialism without talking about the logic of colonial capitalism as well. Now, the third point that follows from that is how, in the process of marginalizing, erasing, silencing Southeast Asians as peoples, as communities, we also must remember that late modern imperialism was also very much a learning process. And this is also how, the knowledges and the epistemologies and the vocabularies of Southeast Asia were eventually diminished and silenced and relegated to the background or denied altogether. Remember that as these imperial powers grew, not only in power, but in territory, empire building is a learning process where the imperial power learns from one part of the empire. It acquires local knowledges in order to use it in other parts of the empire. And one very, very good example of this would be, the advent of the Congreve rocket, which became one of the weapons of choice of the British Imperial Army in the 19th century. But historians, especially Indian historians, will tell you that the British Congreve rocket was actually based on the Mysorean rocket used by the Kingdom of Mysore, by the armies of Tipu Sultan. And the British were impressed by this Indian technology, the use of rockets in battles, which they then adapted, renamed, of course, as the Congreve rocket. And later, the very same rockets, that were initially inspired by the rockets used by Indians in the Anglo-Mysore Wars would be used in British colonial campaigns in Africa and in Southeast Asia. They were used in Burma. They were used in the Malay Peninsula. They were used in the invasion and the attack on Brunei. They were used in Sarawak. So here is an instance where Asian knowledge was taken, adapted, appropriated to be used for the ends of empire in other parts of the larger imperial domain. And unfortunately, in this process, of course, our contribution, Southeast Asian knowledges, not only of technology, but of history, of economics, of statecraft, of politics, of philosophy, these knowledges were diminished in turn. Why? They're diminished because these knowledges, these Asian knowledges, do not fit the bill. They do not fit the requirements of a colonial capitalist agenda. So it's during this time, by the time we get to the 19th century, then that so much of our history, our philosophies, our forms of statecraft were seen as backward, primitive, anarchic, unable to govern, unable to bring about progress, etc., etc. From there follows all these Orientalist cliches and tropes that most of us are already familiar with through reading the works of people like Edward Said. Finally, let me just state that, in my opinion, throughout this long period, despite the, attending rivalries and competitions between the various kingdoms of Southeast Asia, and we cannot deny that there were rivalries and competition between the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, but despite that, I would argue that Southeast Asia itself was never really in a state of crisis. Southeast Asia was never in a state of crisis because Southeast Asian polities had already found a means through which these rivalries and competitions could be mediated through, like I said, a basket of different strategies, from strategic alliances to vassalage to tribute paying, whereby normality could be sustained and trade could be sustained and life could go on for us. The crisis was never ours. The crisis, that contributed to all these wars was a crisis in Europe. It was a crisis in Europe as European kingdoms, faced mortal enemies and the existential threat of war in Europe that was unfortunately then exported abroad because these European nations were no longer simply nations or kingdoms, but they had grown to become empires. And when empires fight, their entire imperial domains are affected. So the crisis was never ours. The crisis was a European crisis that was fought out in various theaters of war, from Africa to Central America, South America, all the way across Asia. And they became our problems. So in summary, then, we could say that, their wars became our wars. And we were dragged unwillingly at times into the wars of others. What this does mean is that no matter how we look at it, our history, Southeast Asian history, is world history. We must always remember that our history is world history. We have to locate ourselves, in the context of much larger, bigger, longer, older historical processes that embed us in a much bigger landscape, historical landscape, of which have always been an active part. Our history is world history, and we today, of course, as living as we do, as post-colonial Southeast Asians, have inherited this history, for better or worse. Some would say that, we are now cursed with the legacy of the colonial state. Scholars like Basil Davidson have argued that, one of the lasting, enduring legacies of empire is the colonial state, upon which the post-colonial state is built on. Many scholars, Asian and African, have lamented the fact that in so many ways, our forms of statecraft today betray the same mechanics and the same praxis of the colonial state of the past. Basil Davidson would argue that the nation state has become what he calls it, the black man, or in this case, the brown man's burden as well. I partly agree with that. And in fact, I would have to concur that, like it or not, this is our legacy. But what is our task, therefore? What is our task as historians and scholars of Southeast Asia? We live today in a post-colonial, post-Westphalian, post-Cold War world, where we have inherited these vocabularies, whether we like it or not. We even use terms like Southeast Asia that are not our invention, not the invention of our ancestors for certain, but have been hoisted upon us, and they have now become part of our vocabularies. And yet we must continue in our efforts, to decolonize. I think many of us here are genuinely committed to, this long-term project of decolonizing our thought systems, our vocabularies, our epistemologies, our philosophies, our theories, the way in which we understand ourselves in the world, the way in which we understand our praxis of economics and politics and what have you. But we are trapped in a present that has been defined by an imperial past. Like it or not, we are the unfortunate children of that. So therein lies our challenge. And this is a challenge that I think we as Southeast Asian scholars need to be acutely aware of all the time. We are still living in the long shadow of empire. We are still living in the long shadow of the 19th century. It is our duty, I believe, to carry on this task of attempting to decolonize our thought systems and our geographies and our politics and our economics, but with the attendant knowledge that we can never radically locate ourselves outside this chain of history, this stream of history of which we are part of. So this then becomes our particular challenge. It is our burden to bear. It is our challenge. It is our goal, and unfortunately, it is also our tragedy. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Philippine Historical Association and its partners, we would like to extend our heartfelt appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Farish Noor for delivering one of the keynotes in the International Conference of the International Council of Historical and Cultural Cooperation, Southeast Asia, with the theme Arrivals, Conflict and Transformation in Maritime Southeast Asia, 1400 to 1800. Southeast Asian history is world history. And this, the quincentennial commemorations, is our way to look back at our importance as a region and the lessons it brings as we go back to our own identities in the region, in our countries. Thank you again, Dr. Farish. I would like to announce that we are joined in Zoom and Facebook by 330 plus delegates, members, and guests of the PHA and the active watchers from the general public. Due to some technical difficulties, however, we would like to stream belatedly the opening ceremonies and the keynote lecture of Dr. Farish Noor in the PHA Facebook, as well as the Facebook of our partners, NQC and the rest. There's also an alternative streaming at the DLSU Search Facebook. Again, this conference is brought to you by the Philippine Historical Association, Masyarakat Sejawaran Indonesia, Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia, the National Quincentennial Committee, the De La Salle University Southeast Asia's Research Center and Hub, and the University of San Carlos. Please join us in the next sessions. This has been Xiao Chua, Public Relations Officer of the Association. On behalf of our President, Dr. Maria Luisa Camagay, and the rest of the trustees of the association, again, thank you to everyone. I now turn you over to our conference convener, Dr. Fernando Santiago Jr., for the next plenary session. Makasaysayang araw po sa ating lahat and mabuhay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next session, the session with the representatives of the Philippine Historical Association. The first speaker is Assistant Professor at the Asian Center of the University of the Philippines-Diliman. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of the Philippines and his MPhil in History and PhD in History from Leiden University, Netherlands. His research interests are Indonesian studies, colonial and maritime history, Philippine history, and Southeast Asian history. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ariel C. Lopez.
Good morning. Hello, Fernie. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm not sure whether I can you allow me to show my video and also share my screen?
You are permitted.
Okay, but
there it is now. It's loaded
okay.
now.
How about the video?
It's not yet on the screen.
Okay, but I think it's okay. Can you see this, Fernie?
All I see is the title page of your PowerPoint.
Okay, it says unable to start video. You can start your video because the host has stopped it. Okay, but anyway, I can start. It's no problem. I can do just the audio. Okay. Can you see me?
Oh, we can hear you, but we can't see you. Well, for a moment there, I saw you.
Okay. Anyway, I'll show my PowerPoint.
We can see you now.
Yes. Okay. Salamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Magandang umaga, good morning. So thank you very much to the organizers of this conference, Professor Fernando Santiago and Professor Maria Luisa Camagay of the Philippine Historical Association, as well as the officers of the Masyarakat Sejarawan Indonesia and Malaysian Historical Society. So the title of this presentation is Sulu and Maguindanao in the Malay-Indonesian World, 16th to 18th century continuities and disjunctures. The goal of this presentation is rather straightforward. First is to highlight the key historical episodes that show the overseas connections of Sulu and Maguindanao with the Malay-Indonesian world. And second is to reflect on Sulu and Maguindanao history vis-a-vis that of the Spanish Philippines. One might ask, why Sulu and Maguindanao, as you can see in the slide? Well, these two, I would argue, are the two most important indigenous polities that ever rose in the Philippines. And they are situated, notably, both in so-called land below the winds, which could mean two things. The more general meaning, referring to the land where monsoon winds blow from the southwest, or the Tanah di Bawah Angin, as the title of Anthony Reid's book suggests. And second, as land directly below the typhoon belt that ravages most of central and northern Philippines. So this presentation synthesizes the works of some of the leading scholars on this period, including Dori Kawashima, Indonesian Oman Fatur Rahman, Annabel Gallup, William Henry Scott. So having said that, let me begin with a quote from Ulrich Kratz, professor of Malay at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And I quote, "Nowhere in Southeast Asia have the consequences of a geopolitical, I would say nation-state approach to the academic study of particular regions been more consequential than in the case of the Muslim peoples of the southern Philippines, who never attracted a sustained scholarly interest." One could say that Professor Kratz's remark could well be extended not only to Sulu and Maguindanao, but also to pre-Spanish Philippines in general. It's not very well known that Manila was part of an emerging Chinese Islamic network in Southeast Asia in the 15th century. A person called Admiral Haji Sampobo, more known as Admiral Cheng He, appointed a certain Haji Bongtakeng in Champa to control the flourishing Hanafi Muslim Chinese communities, which were spreading along the coasts all over the Nanyang countries or Southeast Asia. This Haji later appointed a certain Haji Gan Engku from Manila, Philippines, to Tuban in Java to control the flourishing Hanafi Muslim Chinese communities in Java, Kukang, Palembang, and Sambas. And at the time, Tuban was Java's main port with the kingdom of Majapahit as hinterland. This Haji Gan Engku, also known as Arya Teja, had a daughter named Haji Ni Aging Manila, and eventually married Bong Sui Hu, also known as Sunan Ampel, one of the famous Wali Songos of Java. So you see these connections, Islamic connections of Manila with Champa, what is now Vietnam, and Java. But all of these would, of course, change with the arrival of the Spaniards. One of the key Spanish aims in the 16th century was to eliminate this growing Islamic network. And as William Henry Scott summarizes very well, first, Mindoro must be neutralized from the point of view of the Spaniards to give access to Manila. Then Manila must be taken to capture the China trade. Next, Borneo must be reduced to break the Malaccan connection. And lastly, Jolo and Maguindanao must be neutralized for direct access to the Spice Islands to the south. So the Spaniards attacked Mindoro in 1570, Manila in 1571, Borneo and Jolo in 1578, Mindanao in 1579, and the Moluccas in 1582. So the story is known to us. Manila fell to the Spaniards and became a Hispanic presidio town, later became an important transshipment point in the Trans-Pacific Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. Manila and its elites ceased looking into the cultural and economic world of Southeast Asia. Instead, the former rulers of Manila were effectively Hispanized and given economic privileges in a system dominated by the Spaniards. But on the other hand, the rulers of Maguindanao and Sulu remained connected with the Malay-Indonesian world, partly as a consequence of their favorable location between the frontiers of two competing empires, the Spanish and the Dutch. This could be seen in religious networks. North Sulawesi elites in the 18th century, for instance, sent their children to Maguindanao to study Islam. And one of the most likely candidate, and to whom the North Sulawesi elites sent their children to in order to study, is a person named Abdul Majid Mindanawi, a Shafi'ite scholar, who wrote an introductory theological treatise while in Aceh, perhaps on his way back to his Mindanao homeland. One should not forget Sultan Ali Muddin or Sultan Azimuddin I, who is half Tausug but also half Bugis. And he was initially educated in Islamic jurisprudence by a faqih named Abdul Rahman, who came to Sulu via Batavia and likely had connection as well with Banten in West Java. When Sulu and Maguindanao rulers communicate with Europeans, mainly Dutch, Spanish, in English, they use Jawi, or Arabic script adapted from Malay. There are a good number of Jawi documents in Manila and elsewhere in Spain, and many of them remain are yet unread and remain to be fully understood. And this has been studied quite well, or some of them at least are catalogued by Annabel Gallop of the British Library. Another arena of connection is politics. This is seen during the revolt of famous Prince Nuku against the Dutch in the late 18th century, about which the late historian Muridan Wijoyo had written about. Prince Nuku revolted against the Dutch rule in Maluku in the late 18th century and allied with the Maguindanaos as well. There is an evidence that Prince Nuku received a gift from then Maguindanao Sultan Kibad Sharial, an Islamic seal. And steel is an important facet of communication and formal diplomacy between among polities in the Malay-Indonesian world, but also between the leaders of these polities with European capitals like Batavia and Manila. And the presentation of such a black lamp seal by Kibad Sharial represented a bestowal of recognition by a great power to a lesser one. And as Annabel Gallop reminds us, these Maguindanao seals, we know that these materials came from Maguindanao because of their quite unique design. You know, this three pointed floral design that is only found in Mindanao. Overseas political connections are also very central to Sulu politics during this period. In 1750, Sultan Bantilan of Sulu wrote to the Spanish Governor General in Manila that he had sent an envoy to Batavia in order to send a letter to the Ottoman Sultan to seek for help against the Spanish attack of Sulu. And this message was also supposed to be relayed from Istanbul to Madrid to complain of the King of Spain of Manila's abrogation of the peace treaty between Sulu and Spanish Manila. The Sultan of Sulu also proudly told the Spanish Governor General that the people of Sulu are good brothers of the Islamic faith from Banjarmasin, Pasir, Bugis, Makassar, and Iranun, as if saying that the Spaniards could not oppress the Sulu because they are connected, they have connections with the outside world. But perhaps one of the most important episodes or known episodes of Sulu Maguindanao involvement in the Malay world was when Sultan Mahmud III of Riau sought help to expel the Dutch in 1787. The Iranuns from North Borneo, these Iranuns originally from Mindanao, sailed to Riau and remained as mercenaries in Siau and Kedah. The Iranun invasion resulted in the capture of dozens of European soldiers and cannons. Haji Umar, a Malucan Maguindanao noble, brought and sold some of the Dutch soldiers in Ternate, which shows an effective Islamic network of resistance against the Europeans from the Malay archipelago in the west to Moluccas in the east and Sulu and Maguindanao in the north. What is the aftermath? You know, this rich connections of Sulu and Maguindanao with the Malay-Indonesian world during the early modern period, unfortunately, would be less by the 19th century. Imperial territorialization, as our colleague Farish Noor has mentioned earlier, led to the branding of acts previously central to indigenous polity building as piracy. More complex religious networks. We also have a rise of more complex religious networks and a more direct connection of Sulu and Maguindanao with Islamic heartland. In the 19th century, for instance, Maguindanao had a Bukharan, what is now Uzbekistan chief religious advisor or Pandita, while Sulu saw an Arab, Turk, and Afghan Qadi, or religious scholar. This is different from the situation in the early modern period where you have greater circulation of Islamic knowledge within the region, while by the 19th century, as I mentioned, you have greater, more direct contact of Sulu and Maguindanao with figures of Islamic orthodoxy originating from outside Southeast Asia. But the 19th century also saw the energies of Sulu and Maguindanao directed towards intensified military campaigns, both by the Dutch and by the Spanish. It's not very well known, but the Dutch also attacked Sulu in the early 19th century, well before the Spanish attack in the mid and late 19th century. So this is less of a conclusion, but more of a reflection. Yes, I think I still have time. But if you have questions, and we can discuss it in the open forum. So what I wanted to show in this presentation is you have a continuity of Sulu and Maguindanao connections with the Malay-Indonesian world throughout the early modern period. Right? And these connections that we are only starting to uncover and unravel through selected archives were cut off during the 19th century. And as Farish Noor rightly puts it, you have a compartmentalization of these regions into colonies and then as nation states. And the second, of course, is that you have an adoption of cosmopolitan culture reflected in religion, in language, in script, in the Jawi script, seemingly as a form of state building, rivalry of state building with Spanish Philippines. Well, the third is less of a conclusion, but more of a reflection in that in order for us to build, to enrich the story of Maguindanao and Sulu connections with the Malay-Indonesian world, we need more people, and we need more scholars to work on them. And many of these archives are sitting in the National Archives of the Philippines, in Mexico, in Madrid, in Seville, and also let's not forget that you have local manuscripts and oral histories in Mindanao that have been mostly forgotten, and because of the military conflict, scholars have not been able to access them fully. So I hope that this presentation does not, helps in promoting and encouraging younger scholars to work on this region, in this sort of topic and archives. So thank you very much. I'll pass the stage to my colleague, Professor Ambeth Ocampo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. So before we proceed with the next lecture, I want to inform the members of the audience that this session is until 12 o'clock noon. Now we will have an open forum after the second lecture. You may ask your questions by raising your hands. There's a button that you can push, okay, that will allow you to raise your hands. And you may type your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box, which you will find at the lower part of your screen. We shall now proceed to the next lecture. Our next speaker is a public historian whose research covers the 19th century, its art, culture, and the heroes who figured in the birth of the Filipino nation. He is professor and former chair of the Department of History of the Ateneo de Manila University. Former chair of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines from 2002 to 2011, he writes a widely read opinion page column for the Philippine Daily Inquirer and moderates growing Facebook and Instagram pages. So ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ambeth R. Ocampo.
Okay. Thank you very much. Um, my talk is very general. It will be basically about maps and how maps can be read to show how we became a nation. Maps are very obsolete things now because we can find them on Google or anything. But as a historian, I've always been looking at maps, and it is only recently that I found out that it can be read as a historical source and will provide a lot of us with some um, idea of where we came from and why we are the way that we are. So basically, the main points that I will make in this short talk will simply be about seeing history from geography or how the world has been written. We will talk about maps and how it traces the evolution of the Philippines from colony to nation, and end with maps as the idea of nation. No? Okay, wait. Okay, let's see. Okay. The Philippines is a young nation with an old history. And if we know and follow that history is recorded or written history, we even have an older prehistory. And as I've been working researching for a long time, I realized that the complicated story of the Philippines can also be read from old maps. I go back to the way in which I was taught. Like many Filipinos, we are taught in school that the Philippines is composed of 7,107 islands. Now, in 1994, during the Miss Universe Q&A, the Philippine contestant was asked how many islands are there in the Philippines. And she didn't know the exact number, or it didn't come to her. So she tried to buy for time and she asked high tide or low tide. And this brought the house down. Eventually, she answered 7,107 high tide and 7,108 low tide. Now, where do we get that number? If you open the Department of Tourism website, you will find that they claim that the Philippines is composed of 7,107 islands. I looked up the earliest geography textbook I could find from the American period in 1902 gave the number at 3,141. But what's interesting here is that in a map of 1540, a map of Southeast Asia, of Asia actually, you will see on the upper right that it lists an archipelago of 7,448 islands. So where did we get 7,000? That has always been a question. Um, our national mapping agency has now come up based on their new technology with a real number 7,641. It used to be a bone of contention with me and Namria because I kept pressing them to give me the primary source for 7,107, and we find out that their source was a 1941 geographic survey. So anyway, today we have 7,641. We have discovered new islands because of present technology. But the problem with this new number is that they did not include rocks. And under the UN law of the sea, a rock is an island form above water during high tide that is 2,000 square meters. I mean, you can actually build a house on it. So technically now, our number should be 7,641 islands and over 1,000 rocks. So it is more complicated than we think. And textbook history often makes things oversimplified, and to show you that maybe we have to teach our students to be more open to the nuances in history. In school, I was also taught that the definition of an archipelago was that it is a group of islands that is separated by water. It was only much later as an adult when I was looking at old maps. This is the 18th century Murillo Bagay map. And I saw that it was a hydrographic map. And I saw from it that when we look at a map, we always look at land, but we were not taught to see land in terms in relation to water, to see that our settlements were on the coasts, our settlements were on rivers and streams. So what we actually have to realize is that before the Spanish came, the Philippines was actually an archipelago of islands that was connected by water. When the Spanish came in, they drove people inland, but in pre-colonial times, pre-Spanish times, people moved on water. So instead of being a barrier, the sea, the river, water was actually our waterways. We were connected by water. But this is something that we have forgotten. This is also something that Farish mentioned earlier. When our students study the ASEAN, for example, they will be given a map like this. And instead of looking at the map as a whole and seeing connections, we are teaching school children to divide. The Philippines is this shape, it has this map, it has this population. So we see ASEAN as a group of 10 different countries. And nowhere in my schooling was I taught that before the 16th century, this whole area, which is now insular Southeast Asia, was a place that was actually connected by water, culture, language, and many other things. So we have lost uh, our pre-colonial view of Southeast Asia and the Philippines. So what I realized just recently was that school taught me to see division in maps, but history actually shows us connections. And I think this is the theme that animates today's session. No? Ariel's talk and my talk, it's actually looking for connections. Now, old maps trace the development of how the earth was drawn. And in the 14th and 15th century, people didn't know what the world was like, and they populated the sea, the unknown areas of the world, with different kinds of creatures. Now, when you look at it, for example, this map of Asia or Tilius of 1571, you will see on the right, it actually has sea monsters. It has mermaids looking at themselves through mirrors. So this was the type of thing. Of course, we don't know today these things did not exist. But what is important here is it gives us an idea of how people centuries ago saw the world and what it was dangerous about. Now, look at this 1571, Mindanao is very clear. Parts of the Visayas, but Luzon is not yet reckoned. So, depending on who is making the map, you will actually see differences in the way that it is shaped. This Italian map of Asia is quite amusing because you will see it's upside down. China is below and the Philippines or Southeast Asia is on top. When I first looked at this map, I was looking at all the sea creatures again and fascinated by this large fish with water coming out of its back, which was probably a whale. But this particular map, the Gastaldi map of 1563, is important because it is considered the birth certificate of the Philippines. Why? Because when you look very closely, you will see Mindanao is already there, Luzon and the Visayas is not yet there, but the place that was Samar Leyte is mentioned as Filipina. This is the first time that the name Philippines or Filipina actually comes out in a European map. To the left, you will see Archipelago de San Lazaro. Most people do not realize that map should be read to show how we came to be. Now, this map, in Shoten, the Philippines, as you can see, is also configured differently. No? It is horizontal rather than vertical, but it's already complete. You see, Luzon is already there. Parts of the Visayas are already there. This was the way in which it was presented in 1598. This Carius is one of the earliest separate maps, the only map that has just the Philippines on it and not just Southeast Asia. So when you look at it, 1598, these three maps show you the development of how the Philippines was formed, how it was first, in a lying down form, and how it became vertical, and how the shape, the general shape of the Philippines as we know it today, was slowly formed as data came in. Now, we all know that the Philippines was named after Philip II, before he became king. And we were named so by Villalobos in 1543, not by Magellan. And the Philippines was actually Leyte and Samar. Now, this becomes relevant today because the president has, well, floated the idea that maybe we should decolonize our history, decolonize our maps, get rid of the name of the 16th century Spanish king, and call ourselves Maharlika. Unfortunately, this idea, well-meaning as it is, did not push through because the first person who wanted to do this was Ferdinand Marcos, who most people do not want to even remember. So this is a stale uh, idea, but it shows you the way in which people in the present are trying to decolonize their history. Now we look at the naming of the archipelago. You see in old maps that it is Philippine Islands or the islands of Saint Lazarus. Now, when Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, he named the islands the Islas de San Lazaro, the islands of Saint Lazarus. So if we use this as the name of the Philippines, then we would be Lazarianos or Lazarians today. If we are to follow the naming of Mindanao after the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, if we were named after Charles V, then we would not be Filipinos, we would probably be Carolinians today. Then another what if of history. If Manuel I of Portugal did not reject the Magellan plan and they got here first, then we would have been Portuguese. The Philippines might have been named after Manuel and we would be Manuelans today. So it's a question of naming. Now, in this 1601 map of the Indias del Poniente, it shows the demarcation line and the islands of the Philippines, Guam, and the Moluccas. Now, if we follow this and if we became called the Isles of the West, the Islas del Poniente, Filipinos today would be Ponientas, which is actually a bad word. So when you think about it, there are many ways in which we could have been named, and not just Maharlika. One last thing. In Nagasaki in 1645, a world map was made by the Japanese. And this map is particularly interesting because it has pictures of people from different parts of the world. And the Philippines is represented by this couple, and in Japanese it says Luzon. So in many of the Japanese sources, the Philippines is not referred to as the Philippines, but they refer to the biggest island of Luzon as Luzon. So we see also maps as outlines of trade, evangelization, and empire. So for example, this map of 1619, if you look on the upper right, you will see the Spanish and the Dutch fighting over the Philippines. We have a picture of the Philippines already in its correct form. In Lisbon last year, we saw many maps, and we realize now that in the Philippines, we know about Spanish maps, German maps, but there are many Portuguese maps that we don't know about, like the 1643 Atlas, which shows the Philippines as the Portuguese knew it at the time. And I was particularly interested in Luzon because you see very, very early that the names of the town, Bigan, Ilocos, Pangasinan, it's already there. This brought me to the Selden map, which is now in Oxford. And last year it was in Singapore. I'm sorry about the sound. I don't know how to switch it off. But when I went to Singapore, I was the only one in the room. So what I did was I ran my phone all throughout the map to show you what the Philippines was like in the 1650s. And this is a significant map because it is made not by a Westerner, but probably by a Chinese person, probably a trader, which explains why they give the names of the towns in Chinese. So you see the trade routes that were taken at the time. Then we go to evangelization. The Conquest of the Philippine Islands, the book by Gaspar de San Agustin. We see this. This is the frontispiece, and it of course shows you the name of God and the rays going down that blesses the colonization of the Philippines. To the left, you see Saint Augustine, founder of the Augustinians, and behind him, a man holding an astrolabe is Andres de Urdaneta, who was the navigator of the Legazpi expedition. On his right, you have Philip II, and behind him, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, the first governor of the Philippines. Now, when you look at it, the rays, the divine rays go all the way down, and Philip is pointing to the group of islands that now carry his name. So, in the time of Philip II, he had an empire where the sun never set. Now, when we look at it, old maps can also be read in other ways. There are other maps, and one of the most amazing maps, fortunately now, the British Library has recently digitized the entire topographical collection of George III, which is now available high resolution online from the British Library. Before this, one Filipino historian would have to physically go to London to consult the maps, but now you can study it. These maps made in 1761 by two Filipinos. The first one by Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay gives us a map of the Spanish world. And you see a line in the middle that gives us the demarcation line, which shows you the Portuguese side on the right and the Spanish side on the left. From this map, another printmaker, another engraver named Lorenzo Atlas drew on it the personification of Spain, Hispania, and he did a symbolic map of the Hispanic world. And this is what it looks like. When you look very closely, the details are really fantastic. No, you see the flag with the coat of arms of Spain, and the staff is the demarcation line. The crown of Hispania are all the Spanish provinces, and her diadem is northeast, west, south, and it shows the treasure ships that went all throughout in the voyages of discovery. Her cloak is actually Spanish America, and when you look down, her shapely legs are made by the routes that lead from Mexico to the Philippines and from the Philippines back. Where are the Philippines? The Philippines are her chinelas or her zapatillas. No, one the right side is Luzon and the left side is Mindanao. So when we look at it, maps can be seen to show us also how incomplete we know the world. This 18th century map shows us the new Philippines, and many people ask, what is this? Because we have forgotten that in old Spanish maps, it was maps of the Philippines were not just the Philippines, but they included the Marianas and they included the Caroline Islands, which were governed from Manila or Cebu. So Guam, Palaos, Marianas, Carolinas, these were part of the former Spanish Empire. In the end of the empire, this beautiful map is now in a home in Manila. It was made, given as a gift of the city of Manila to the widow of the assassinated Spanish premier. It is made of silver and gold and precious stones, but it shows you how the shape of the Philippines was at the end of the Spanish Empire. Because we know after the Spanish American War, the United States won, and as you can see here, an illustration of Uncle Sam looking at his new empire. So by 1898, what was left of the Spanish Empire was taken over by the United States, and in this graphic, they show how the U.S. territory is 10,000 miles tip to tip of the American Eagle. Now, when we look at it, we have to remember that maps are not complete. Maps can include and maps can also exclude. Last year, 5 Filipino historians were invited to Lisbon to give talks on to commemorate the quincentennial and talk about the Magellan expedition. We were photographed for a Portuguese newspaper, and after the pictorial, I saw on the ground that there was a map of the world. So I went, of course, I wanted to post beside the Philippines. And when I post, I realized that how come it's, you know, the Philippines, the shape of the Philippines was there, but it was not identified, like Palau, the Moluccas, Timor, and Malacca. And you realize here that while it is a map of the world, what they are emphasizing is the Portuguese part of the world at the time. In the afternoon, we gave a talk in the Geographic Society of Lisbon, and I was drawn to this huge wall map about the great voyages, maritime voyages of the Portuguese. And it was interesting because when you switched off the light, it was a glow in the dark map. And you saw that Ferdinand Magellan 1521 is shown on this map, and he goes to the Philippines. But Ferdinand Magellan ends in Cebu. The circumnavigation does not continue. Why doesn't it continue? Because it was continued by Elcano, who was a Spaniard. So again, this shows you how maps can include and also exclude. In the pre-2016 banknote of Indonesia, it carried a map of Indonesia, which was a bit controversial because if you look at the map of Indonesia, while the pink color is Indonesia, they included parts in white, which was part of Malaysia and part of Papua New Guinea. It was probably for aesthetic purpose or probably they were laying claim. It became a controversial part of their banknotes. In the Philippines, we also have that, our newest banknotes on the 1,000 peso bill. We have a map of the Philippines. Um, when I was consulted for the map, I actually wanted that the banknotes become a teaching tool, that parts of the map would be on different banknotes so that we put it together like a jigsaw puzzle and we form the map. Of course, that suggestion was thrown out, so they put this here. When the bill was actually circulated, we received criticism from the public saying that the map was incomplete and that people from various parts of the Philippine island saying that their map, their island was not represented. But that's a very, very small, it's a banknote. Fortunately, then President Aquino said that if I am lost, I won't open my wallet and look at the map on the banknote. I will open Google. So when we think about this, how much can you put on a piece of paper is a big question. This also reminded me of the late Carlos P. Romulo, Foreign Secretary, signatory to the UN Convention. When the logo of the United Nations was first presented, you can see it in the back. If you look at it, the center of the universe is the United States. A, because the UN headquarters are in New York, and B, the designers were American. When the draft was shown to Romulo, he asked, where is the Philippines here? And the designer said, we didn't put the Philippines there. And he said, why not? And he said, because it's so small. And if we put it there, it will be nothing but a dot. And Romulo roared, I want the damn dot. So give it to me. And that's why it is claimed that the Philippines is represented by a dot. Now, today, old maps have also been used in territorial disputes. As you know, Japan and Korea are fighting over a part of the sea that is known all over as the Sea of Japan, but the Koreans want to call the East Sea. We have the same thing in the Philippines because of our dispute with China over their nine-dash line. The South China Sea has been renamed, as far as we are concerned, as the West Philippine Sea. The retired Supreme Court Justice Antonio Carpio explained to me some years ago how he used this 18th century Murillo Bagay map to counter the historical claims of China. What he pointed out was when you look at this part of Palawan, what is now known as the Spratly Islands were in the map and they were called Los Bajos de Paragua. The Chinese have not been able to show any map older than the Murillo Bagay map of 1734 to show these shoals as part of Chinese territory. Then we have the dispute over what is now known as the Scarborough Shoal, which come in different names depending on the source. So the Philippines call it Panatag, another The Chinese call it Wangyang Dao. There's Democracy Reef. But in 1734, in the Bagay map, you see that it is listed as Panakot threat. And it is quite, how would you say this, significant that there are three shoals there. One is called Galit, anger. The other is called Lumbay, sorrow. And Scarborough Shoal is threat, quite aptly named today. So, when we think about it, maps develop not only to give us a sense of how the world became what it was, but it also gave different countries the representation of nation and the representation of self. So therefore, today it's very popular that people wear their nationalism literally on their sleeves by wearing a map of the Philippines, because this has become a sense of identity and a sense of who we are. So knowing the development will not only tell us about what the Philippines is like today, but will also tell us about how we came to be and open us, as Farish told us, about the larger context of ourselves, not just in Asia, but also in the world. So as a parting shot, basically, I hope that people will look at maps, even if they are old and obsolete, and to see in maps not just divisions, but to find connections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ambeto Campo. We'll now proceed to the open forum, and I'd like to request Professor Ocampo and Dr. Lopez to leave their cameras on. Please turn on your cameras. I see a raised hand from Mr. Emmanuel Mabagos, but so as to give him a little time to prepare for his question, I would like to direct my question to Dr. Lopez. Can you hear me, Dr. Lopez?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So, well, you made a very relevant presentation earlier, and I was very fascinated by things that you mentioned in the latter part, particularly with regard the under-researched Islamic and Jawi sources. So and I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about these sources, and if you can tell us what you believe are needed to be able to utilize them more effectively.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. With regard to Javi sources, there are a handful of scholars who are working on this, and of course the foremost one is Isaac Donoso from University of Alicante in Spain. But even him, he hasn't, he has taken photos of these archives, but he hasn't read most of these archives. And having said that, these are uncatalogued, you know, meaning they still need to be well curated, selected, and labeled. You know? But in terms of skills, I think the only school that teaches, I know two centers where you have people capable of teaching Jawi. One is in London, School of Oriental and African Studies under Dr. Mulaika Hijas, and another is in, I think in Universidad Islam Negeri, if I'm not mistaken, but it's where you have Asyumadi Asra and Oman Fatur Rahman, both Indonesians. So this, so learning the script is one thing, right? But learning the language is another. The language of these Jawi scripts, if you already learn the script, like the Latin script, no, if you know the Jawi script, it's one thing. That's the first step. The second step is you know the language, and the language is a mixture of Malay, some Spanish words, some, if it's from Sulu, then some Tausug words. If it's from Maguindanao, then some Maguindanao words. So even for, say, a scholar who knows Spanish and who can read Jawi, it's still difficult if he doesn't know Maguindanao, and or Taosu. So it has to be a collaborative research.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Mabagos, you may now ask your question. Please unmute your microphone. I've given you the authority to speak.
Happened.
Can you hear me, Mr. Mabagos? Well, there's another raised hand from Mr. Philemon Hunterial. You may now ask your question, Mr. Hunterial. Please unmute your microphone.
They're not unmuting.
If you're having difficulty unmuting your microphone, please type in your question in the chat box.
Yes,
I can hear you now.
Professor. You don't have to see me, no?
Yes,
It's
yes,
okay.
that's fine. Yeah.
It's all right. Professor Ocampo, would there be any available map at all that would have been attributed to the Austronesians?
Mm.
You know, they have, as you know, they were the first from Taiwan to go to the, even as far as Madagascar, Indonesia, and so forth. Would there be any available map that would be attributed to them?
Okay.
They were superb maritime peoples.
As I mentioned in my talk, most of the maps that I sourced were Western maps. No, they were made by Europeans, published in Europe. We do not know if some of the maps that we have were based on earlier Austronesian maps. One of the things that we really have to do, because most of the maps are printed, so they can be sourced and traced, but there are many manuscript maps in Lisbon, in Spain, which are not just drawn by Spanish, but they Spanish and Portuguese. They also got data from the people in the field. So that's a good question. It's something that we have to find out. Earlier maps, non-Western maps of the region, to help us understand the topic much better. Thank you. There's a question.
Thank you.
Yes, there's a question from Vic Torres about stories of how these maps were made and kept from competitors. That is now coming out. When we were in Lisbon last year, some of the maps that I was shown, I've never known about, simply because they were manuscript maps, were not printed. And in the age of discovery, everyone was very jealous and very secretive about their maps, which explains why maps have different shapes and sizes based on the data that they had. So they were keeping things from each other, and it was only much later that we actually have maps which are already complete. But just as Ariel was talking about, it's a great historiographical enterprise. We have to go back to the manuscript sources, and again, it's not just knowing Portuguese. I mean, no Filipino I know reads Portuguese. That's the thing. No one reads Dutch. Spanish is a dying breed. So it's basically not just accessing the documents, but being able to unlock them because we are separated from the past because of culture and because of language. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I answered too long.
We have another question from Daya Wijaya, and it is directed to you, Professor Ocampo. So the question is, are there any other European maps instead of Chinese maps dated from the 16th century for the Southeast Asian region?
We have not found anything yet. We're hoping that in our archives we will find one. When we many years ago, our foreign ministry had offered me a grant to go all around the world for a year, not to teach for a year, just to dig up all the maps that I could find in order to disprove the Chinese historical claims. And it was my big mistake to say that the Chinese probably have maps older than ours. And I did not take that up. It's one of the regrets of my life. But Justice Carpio followed this line of thinking, and what he has proven is that the Chinese cannot produce a map older than 1734 that shows the disputed territory today within their area. So we're hoping that there is more. Now, the Selden map is quite interesting because really it was made probably by a Chinese person or some a Chinese put in. They're still trying to find out, who made it and why. But I'm sure there must be something. We always lie in hope to find a new source and a source that comes from an Asian perspective rather than a Western one. I wish I had a better answer. Thank you.
Okay. Well, there's actually another question for you in the Q&A, but before we proceed to that, I'd like to ask Professor Lopez another question. And this has to do with a statement you made near the end of your presentation, where basically it won't be enough to just base your understanding of the past of Southeast Asia on historical documents. You need to look into oral tradition and among other things. But how would that affect the historicity of the past? I
Yeah.
mean, or can one argue that by sticking to the standards of the historical discipline, one is essentially reinforcing the Western, uh, basis of what an acceptable past should be.
Should be.
Thank you, Dr. Santiago, for the question. And I'm sure that my fellow colleagues, Professor Ocampo and Professor Farish Noor, have great ideas about this. No, it's a historiographical, methodological, but also a question of perspective. No, I think it is very possible to incorporate oral tradition, oral histories, and to be used alongside uh, written, mainly European sources, exactly to provincialize, these European perspectives and European narratives about Southeast Asia. Um, and unfortunately, if you go to a history program in the Philippines and perhaps elsewhere in Southeast Asia, you are taught, well, first and foremost, to write in English. If you want to study Indonesia, you study Dutch, or want to study, European language. If you are not taught how to access or to, um, if you want to study Mindanao, there's no program, as far as I know, for you to study Tausug or to study Maranao or Maguindanao language. So this is um, but of course, it doesn't mean that that the people themselves have no way of retelling their past. There are ways, but we have to be more creative in finding where they tell their stories. Um, Recently, I found very interesting stuff in Facebook, because as more and more people get access to the internet, first and foremost, I think through Facebook, then they start to tell their stories, and these are not peer reviewed. These are not you know um, fortunately it's written in Tagalog, and these are stories that could very much enrich the sources that you see in Spanish or Dutch archives. Um, so there are ways, but we have to be more creative and less, I think, less rigid, and get out of the traditions that were taught to us in historiography classes. I'm sure Professor Noor and Professor Ocampo have words about this too as well.
Yes, I think Professor Farish was raising his hand earlier. Would you like to share your insights?
Thank you very much. I'd just like to connect the points made by Ariel and Ambeth here. And I think when we look at things like maps, for instance, our very understanding of what constitutes a map, what a map should look like, is also something we need to interrogate. Because this is a point made by Ben Anderson, of course, when he talks about how Asians had very different ways of drawing maps. And our maps were not necessarily drawn.
Yeah.
So if I may, can I give an example? If we were to look at, for example, the Hikayat Hang Tuah, which is one of the most important and famous, epics of Malay literature, one can read the Hikayat Hang Tuah also as a map, because it actually gives you directions how to travel from Malacca to India to China to Java to Patani and elsewhere. So it's a map. It's a map without pictures. And if one were to look at, for instance, a piece of Indonesian batik, many classical forms of batik basically feature cosmological maps that place human beings in relation to nature and the divine. So these are also maps, and that's why I agree very much with what Ariel is saying. I think a lot of our maps, of course we mapped, we did map, otherwise we would not have moved anywhere. We needed maps to travel. But I think our maps were also contained in the forms of narratives and stories and songs. And I think the sad tragedy of this colonial encounter was that certain modalities of knowledge production have become privileged. And I think Amber and I, we must agree on this, right? I mean, the map is a powerful document, but it's so powerful that it means that other types of map making have been forgotten. And I think this is the challenge for us, and therefore I think Ariel's point is very important, that it's in oral history and material history that we find other documents. Documents don't have to come in the form of books or maps. Maps can also not look like maps. That's all I wanted to say.
That was actually interesting, Farish, that all our papers for this session actually form one complete whole. It's actually looking again and finding connections, which was my whole point. The way that we are educated is that the West divided and taught us to see division, but looking at Southeast Asia again will show us commonalities and show us connections. A different way of looking at the past, a different way of relating to the past, which I think is quite important in a global and globalizing world.
Well, since Professor Farish is now part of the panel, there was a comment made earlier about your lecture by Daya Wijaya, and I'd like to read it if you don't mind. He just said that I want to make a comment on Professor Farish's suggestion on the deconstructive approach. In recent times, Southeast Asian historians tend to re-narrate their historiographical work from their Southeast Asian perspectives. It might be determined by the light of post-colonialism or nationalism. Now, for my case of study on the Portuguese expansion to Eastern Indonesia, using the local sources, Hikayat Tanah Hitu, Kronik Bakan, and Hikayat Ternate, are not enough to understand the Portuguese presence. So we should utilize the European sources as well. So that I tend to propose the Eurasian perspective. It seems more humanistic to me. That was his comment.
Well, if I may, I'll give a very quick reply. I actually replied to that comment, and I do agree. I'm particularly worried of one thing, if I might say. I think particularly after decolonization in the 50s and 60s, quite a few post-colonial historians in Asia and Africa naturally wanted to rewrite their national histories. But that's the problem, and this is Ambeth's point as well, right? We've already been divided. So when we write our histories, we write our national history. We write the history of Philippines. We write the history of Uganda. We write the history of, we don't write about the history of Africa. We don't write about the history of Southeast Asia. We've lost that. And this, for me, is potentially worrying because it opens the way for very narrow nationalist historical narratives that I think might also be inaccurate, because there's a lot of erasure that's also taking place there. So I agree with Daya's point. This interconnected histories, our histories talk to each other. And we must always remember that throughout this long period of colonial contact, don't forget, in the West, there were also voices of dissent. I've made it a point to write about, British writers who are against empire. And in so many ways, we have notable writers, commentators, academics, statesmen in Europe and in America who were likewise opposed to imperialism because they saw it for what it was. It was just a land grab, power grabbing. Even the British occupation of Java that I mentioned earlier, this was heavily debated back in England. And I think our responsibility as humanist historians is to connect these voices as well. These are our potential allies. These historical figures are equally important in our history. So it's not a case of replacing, the good white man, bad black man with good black man, good white, bad white man. That's just a reversal of dialectics, and that doesn't get us anywhere. So I'm in agreement with the point made by Daya, and that I hope is also what I've been trying to do myself, and I'm sure many of us.
Good. Would anyone else like to comment? Okay. Well, we have another raised hand from Mr. Philemon, but before I see he lowered his hand. So I will read a question from the chat box, and it is directed to Dr. Lopez and Dr. Farish Noor. How did the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao treat the Dutch in the 18th and 19th centuries? Were they treated as their allies? Did they focus more in Muslims in the Malay archipelago try to unite and declare a jihad against Europeans? And that's basically how the question goes.
Lopez, do you want to start first?
The question is from Kevin Santos. Yeah, and Dr. Lopez,
Okay.
you may.
Yep. I think there is a widespread view, but I think rather narrow or outdated, that while the Spaniards were concerned with conversion, the Dutch were only concerned with trade. But that is not true. The Dutch were also concerned with religious conversion, especially in eastern Indonesia, in areas where Islam hasn't is not yet very strong. So they would try to convert the local rulers if they could. But I think the opposite, the Spaniards were different in the sense that they were more active. So both of them were concerned with religion, and by the end of the 18th century, I think there is an increasing importance of Islam as a rallying point of a commonality, of common identity among rulers of aristocratic elites of the Malay-Indonesian world, including Sulu and Maguindanao. And I think the Dutch knew this. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may add to what Ariel has said, I think there are 2 points. One, religion, like any forms of identity, has always been brought into politics. This is not new, but we also need to understand that this is fundamentally politics. And Southeast Asian states were actually very, very good at politics. So let's never make the assumption that a commonality of religion necessarily means solidarity. That's not true, because we can just look at the long history of Burma and Siam, right? From the Tangyeo dynasty all the way to the Alangpaya dynasty. In Siam, from Ayutthaya all the way to Ratanakosin. These kingdoms have been at war for hundreds of years, and these are Buddhists killing Buddhists. Yeah? And in the course of doing so, they were quite willing to court the French and the British to help them whenever it worked. This is Southeast Asian statecraft. Yeah, and so whether it's Buddhist or Muslim, these polities could see opportunities for strategic advantage. And when they saw it, they did so with a very modern understanding of how to gain leverage when it suited them. So So although it could be dressed in the language of, say, holy war or religious war, fundamentally, we were actually very good politicians. Unfortunately, by the 18th century, this tactic didn't work anymore because we lost our technological advantage. At the beginning in the Spice Islands, for example, the people of the Spice Islands could get the Dutch to oust the Portuguese because you have some parity. Our weapons technology was as good as theirs. But unfortunately, by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century, once the Europeans have rockets, machine guns, rifled muskets, carronades, it's the Europeans who begin to turn the situation to their advantage. And that's where then the attempts by Southeast Asian polities and nations to hedge and to play was diminished. But as I said earlier in my presentation, this wasn't just the case for us in Southeast Asia. The same happened in India. The British and the French took advantage of the conflict between the Mysorean kingdom, the Maharathas, the Mughals, and the Hyderabadis, and all of this eventually led to the divide and rule of India and the eventual rise of British supremacy there. So that's our sad story. But our ancestors were actually quite smart. They knew how to play politics long before anyone even coined the term realpolitik. We were already doing realpolitik. So we don't need Westphalia to teach us that. We were already doing that stuff long before they were doing it, because we were doing it with China and India long before the Europeans came.
Can I say something apropos to that? Thanks for that, Farish. But when you think about it, next year we were supposed to be in Cebu, and next year we're looking back at the Magellan expedition, and it's the same thing. The way that the story has been told, this is an invader coming. Lapu-Lapu is protecting the Philippines, but the Philippines did not exist in 1521 as we know it. And what you actually see there was that how Humabon of Cebu actually leveraged Magellan to fight Lapu-Lapu in Mactan. And unfortunately, Magellan was overconfident and he died there. But that part of the story is very important and should be brought out, because that is not the way that it is taught in our textbooks, to show how our ancestors actually used it. You talk divide and rule, you always think of that, but it's also a question of maybe we should also look at who the real villains are. The ruling class will always accommodate with whatever will suit their purpose. So it will also help us understand the way in which we did things in the past and see relevance in the present.
Okay. So I'd like to return to the question I mentioned earlier. I'm sorry that we're jumping from topic to topic because I'm addressing questions chronologically. But in the Q&A box, an anonymous attendee directed the question to you, Professor Ocampo. And it's about the similarities and differences of Asian maps with Western maps. Would you like to share insights?
Yes, I answered it on the chat. This session has actually made me rethink my original, because I was so focused just to show the Philippines and how it was formed. But now, thanks to Farish, it's good now to look further than the Philippines to see the rest of the maps of Asia and see how our neighbors also fit into it. So what were Chinese, Japanese maps? I don't know enough of them to compare and contrast, but as I mentioned in the answer to that, I said I'd like to look more at these Asian maps and maybe come up with another presentation.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a couple of questions in the chat box. And the first one, I'm sorry, it comes from Mario Aguja. And it's a question on, was there ever a unified Southeast Asian or sultanates, principalities, action against the colonial powers in the region? So it's more of a factual question, actually. Was there ever any effort to, among the sultanates to unite against Westerners or the Western powers? And the question was, well, I think it was addressed to Dr. Lopez.
Lopez, yeah.
Right. Well, the short answer to that is no. There was never a unified coalition or alliance against Western powers in the Philippines or in Indonesia or Malaysia. In fact, one of the tropes, no, that is common in European academia, I think, in the past few decades, is that the reason why the Europeans were accepted in Southeast Asia was because of this dividedness. No? So Europe did not have to have a divide and rule and conquer. To begin with, Southeast Asia was already divided.
Mhm.
Whether you agree with that, that's a different thing. But what you
Or
see in
had not
Southeast,
united, had not united to begin with.
yeah,
So
well,
there's
yeah,
nothing to divide. Yeah.
yeah, there's nothing to divide because Southeast Asia is already divided. Why would you divide and conquer? So what I think that the case is that the studies that emerged from this wave of from this trope, no, from this idea, is that you have studies that emphasize how one faction of a sultanate uses, a European, say the Dutch, to to monopolize the power against a competing, say, brother, cousin. So this is I think a historical reality. But whether that defines the narrative of Southeast Asian sultanates, it's a different thing. So historical reality, I think, is more complicated than than these things. It's not always European versus Southeast Asians, but it's also not always Southeast Asians versus Southeast Asians. Depends on the historical context.
Thank you. There's actually another question very much related to that from Jose Victor Torres. And the question, I just want to read it. How much did trade play in the creation of politics of the region? Did it create or break alliances in the interest of business? So that was, again, directed to you, Dr. Lopez. I think you covered it already, but is there anything else you'd like to add to that? The role of business in, the division.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is how the Filipino elites or the elites of Luzon and Visayas were initially more capitalist, you could say, before the Spanish arrival, and because of their because of Spanish subjugation, the elites of, say, Manila and Cebu became less capitalist. And they used to travel to different parts of Southeast Asia, trade. If you recall the book of Laura Lee Junker, Trading, Raiding, and Fisting. So trading is one important pillar to become a qualification of become a datu, of a chief, of a raja. And the arrival of the Spaniards took away that trading part and effectively bureaucratized the elites of Luzon and the Visayas. But this enterprising qualification of this merchant king remained in for Sulu and Maguindanao. Yeah, so trade is really important. You could not access firearms through the Europeans if you do not have an effective, a good port polity. You need to attract Chinese. You need to be able to facilitate the trade between the uplands and the lowlands, the Iraya and the sea. So if you do not have, it's all connected, right? If you do not have security of your port, then no one would trade. Yeah, so especially for island Southeast Asia, maritime trade is very important in polity formation. Right? perhaps less in mainland states where you have large agrarian kingdoms.
Thank you. So we have time for only one last question, and the question is addressed to Professor Ambeth Ocampo. So it says, I think it comes from Chiara Martinez. And the question is, I think Sir Ambeth Ocampo mentions the schools and our approach to teaching Philippine history. There's so many things that we need to improve. I just would like to hear a word from him, given these changes and interconnection of our history in Southeast Asia, most especially. Is there a need to change the curriculum in the Philippines, educational system, especially in the field of history or social sciences?
Um, we're always in need of innovation. There's always a need for revision. We should always improve our curriculum. But as I mentioned in my presentation today, it's something that I myself felt. I mean, when I had to live in Southeast Asia, it was the only time that I realized how come I know a lot about Spain or the US, but we don't know our neighbors. We don't know the Thais. We don't know the Indonesians. It was actually when I lived for 9 months throughout Southeast Asia that I saw um, connections, and that's what made me, rethink the way in which I was taught, and makes me rethink that maybe we should actually emphasize, like when we study, as I mentioned in the presentation, when we study ASEAN, we just look at, the shapes of the different countries. We look at their maps. We talk about their forms of government, GDP, etc. But it does not tell you about a time before the 16th century when this whole area, this island, Southeast Asia, was basically connected by water, by culture, by language, and many other things. That I think Farish is correct in showing us that these are things which we have forgotten because of our colonial experience. But also the other thing, which people don't like to hear, is that we're taught a nationalist history, and that's a problem when nationalism becomes handmade to history. Those things do not really go together. And I'd like to think that when you show that, when you look at the countries of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Thailand, that what we are today was the birth of these countries were born out of a colonial experience, and it is something that you have to accept. You cannot throw that away with the bathwater, but it helps us understand. So it's looking at the past as a process of becoming, that is important, and history plays a big role in that. Just so that you know, yesterday during our practice session, Farish and I were talking about how do we recast history, or the narrative, in the way that such that our students will learn more about the neighbors and probably understand themselves a bit more. It's a long process, but again, as the Chinese say, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and we started with that brief conversation yesterday, and I hope it will come to something. So I'd like to tell you, Kiara, I mean, I'm retiring next year, but that won't be the end of me. I'll be writing a new textbook, which will hopefully bring us to this way of showing our students, to young people, to look for connections. No? That's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ocampo. Any parting words from Dr. Lopez and Professor Noor? Would you like to say anything?
Only that I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm very, very happy to be in this panel with Ambeth and Ariel.
Yes, I think we should do this more often. Scholars, historians and history enthusiasts in Southeast Asia should speak to each other more often, and also not always in formal occasions, but perhaps more important in informal occasions, over beer, perhaps.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
That was one of the things that we missed in this conference, not just seeing each other, but as you know, for many people who are listening, it's not the conference that's important for scholars. It's actually the coffee breaks and the meals that makes for a lot of interpollination between us. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Well, certainly, this session has not only been, thought-provoking, but certainly fun. I had fun. Okay, this was a fun discussion. To end this session, I'd like to read a comment in the chat box by the treasurer of the Philippine Historical Association, Dr. Arlene Calara. And she said, the expertise and knowledge of the speakers are excellent. This is a great academic experience, challenging and thought-provoking. So maraming salamat on behalf of the organizers. Again, thank you very much for sharing us your knowledge, your wisdom, okay, and for sparing time to participate in this international conference. So thank you, and I wish you a nice day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So at this point, we will end the morning session, and we will resume at 1:30 with the session represented. With the session with the Persatuan Sejarah Malaysia, represented by Professor Dato Ahmad Murad Merican. So we will resume at 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernie.
Thank you. You're welcome. And, very fascinating.
Thanks.
Fernie, can I ask, at this point, can I log out and log in again at 1:30?
Yes.
All right. Okay, got it. So it's all right for me to leave, yeah?
Yes, just
All
press
right.
the end button at the bottom.
Okay, and then when I come in again, I use the same link
The
like
same
before.
link, please. That's
Got it.
correct.
All right. Okay. Nice to see you, Ariel. I really enjoyed your presentation as well. Let's hope we all get to meet up soon.
Okay.
Bye.